My father sold me for 25 cents. And in that dusty saloon, a young girl's life was traded for the price of a drink. The then boots thundered. A mountain man rose, and his voice shook the room. I'd pay millions for you. From that moment, nothing would ever be the same, because rescuing her meant war with her father, and with the railroad men who wanted her land more than her life. Snow falls on a lonely cabin. A church bell tolls. Jail keys rattle in the dark. A girl who once thought she was worthless must now prove to a whole town that she cannot be bought. But behind closed doors, powerful men are plotting, and one truth about her mother's legacy could change everything. Will the mountain man's courage and her own voice be enough to save her? Or will the world treat her as nothing more than 25 cents? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Saloon's smoky haze hung thick in the air as rough-hewn miners crowded around their tables, warming themselves against the bitter winter night. Wind whistled through the gaps in the weathered walls, making the oil lamps flicker and dance. At the long wooden bar, Zoila's father swayed on unsteady feet, his face flushed from too much whiskey. Ain't worth the trouble to feed her, he slurred, fishing in his pocket. The coins clinked as they scattered across the bar's scarred surface. His thick fingers pushed a single quarter forward. Who'll trade me a bottle for the girl? Zoila stood frozen, her small frame trembling as she pressed herself against the wall. Her dark eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there too, a quiet dignity passed down from her Cherokee mother. The gathered miners laughed, some calling out cruel jokes that made her flinch. Donald McCord set his tin cup down with deliberate care. The chair creaked as he pushed back from his table, his broad shoulders drawing up to their full height. Years of mountain living had weathered his face like tanned leather, but his eyes burned with righteous anger as he crossed the room in long strides. I'd pay millions for her soul before I'd let you waste her life. His voice boomed through the saloon like summer thunder, silencing every tongue. The oil lamp seemed to dim as he placed his calloused hand on Zoila's shoulder, gentle but firm. She stiffened at first, then leaned slightly toward his steady presence. Her father's bloodshot eyes narrowed. And your business, McCord. He took an unsteady step forward, fists clenching. Made it my business when you put a price on your own. Flesh and blood, Donald replied, his voice hard as mountain granite. The other miners shifted uneasily in their seats, some looking away in shame, others watching with predatory interest to see if violence would erupt. The tension crackled like static before a storm. Zoila's father lunged forward, but his drunken feet betrayed him. He stumbled, catching himself on the bar's edge. Before he could recover, the town preacher stepped between them, his warm Bible clutched in weathered hands. That's enough. Reverend Shaw's voice cut through the thick air. There's been too much darkness in this room already. We need God's light, not more fighting. The preacher's presence seemed to drain some of the poison from the air. The miners began to mutter amongst themselves, turning back to their drinks. Zoila's father spat on the floor, but made no move to continue the confrontation. Donald kept his hand steady on Zoila's shoulder. Come on, child, he said softly. Let's get you somewhere safe. She nodded, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. They stepped out into the winter night, leaving the warmth and smoke behind. The street was empty, dusted with fresh snow that drifted down in lazy spirals. Zoila's thin dress offered little protection against the cold, and she shivered as they walked away from the saloon's yellow windows. Delicate snowflakes caught in her long eyelashes as she glanced up at Donald. Her expression was a mixture of fear and hope, like a wild creature unsure whether to flee or trust. The mountain man's heart ached, remembering another young face from long ago. His daughter, lost with her mother to fever years before. My cabin's up in the hills, he said, keeping his voice gentle. It ain't much, but there's a warm fire and clean blankets. You'll be safe there." He knew taking her in would bring trouble. The law had certain views about such things, and her father wouldn't likely let the matter rest. But looking down at her vulnerable face in the snowy night, Donald knew he couldn't choose differently. Zoila nodded again, and some of the tension left her shoulders. Together they walked through the softly falling snow, their boots leaving paired tracks in the fresh white powder. The sound of the saloon faded behind them, replaced by the quiet whisper of windblown snow and the distant cry of a lone coyote in the hills. Each step took them further from the town's judgment and cruelty, toward the promise of sanctuary in Donald's mountain home. The quarter her father had offered still lay on the saloon's bar, a cold testament to how little some men valued the precious gift of a child's life. But in defying that darkness, Donald had declared a deeper truth, that every soul carried worth beyond measuring, beyond price, beyond the small minds of those who would treat people like property to be traded. The night air bit sharp and cold as Donald led Zula to where his animals were tethered outside the saloon. His old bay horse dozed with one hoof cocked, while the sturdy pack mule shifted restlessly in the falling snow. Zoila stood shivering, pulling a threadbare shawl tight around her thin shoulders as she watched Donald check the cinches and adjust the stirrups. "Easy there, Belle," Donald murmured to the mule as he secured their few supplies. The leather creaked in the quiet night, punctuated by the soft nickering of the animals and the distant sounds from the saloon. He turned to find Zoila studying, him with those watchful dark eyes, snowflakes settling in her black hair. "You ever rode before?" he asked gently, keeping his voice low and steady like he would with a spooked deer. When she nodded, he cupped his hands to give her a boost onto the horse. She settled into the saddle with natural grace, though her fingers clutched the worn leather pommel tightly. Donald mounted the mule, and they set off through the sleeping town. The snow-laden street gave way to a narrow trail winding up into the foothills. Fresh powder crunched beneath the animals' hooves as they picked their way carefully along the path. The moon peeked through breaks in the clouds, casting silver light across the pristine white landscape. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds their mounts' steady breathing and the soft thud of hooves in snow. Donald kept a watchful eye on the trail ahead, though his thoughts turned to the small figure huddled in his horse's saddle. The girl hadn't said more than 2 words since leaving town, but he could feel questions building in her like steam in a kettle. Finally, her quiet voice drifted back to him. "Mr. McCord?" She paused, gathering courage. "Why did you help me? Back there?" Donald's chest tightened at the hesitant hope in her tone. He took a long breath of the crisp mountain air before answering. "I had a daughter once," he said, his voice rough with old grief. "Lost her and her mama to fever, years back. Couldn't stand by and watch another little girl get cast aside like she didn't matter." Zoila absorbed this in silence, her small shoulders straight despite the cold. "I'm sorry about your family," she said softly. The trail curved around a stand of snow-laden pines, and Donald's cabin came into view. Golden lamplight spilled from its windows, warm and welcoming against the gathering dusk. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the promise of warmth within. He'd lit the lamps and banked the fire before heading to town that morning, knowing he'd return after dark. They dismounted in the crude stable beside the cabin, where Donald quickly settled the animals with feed and blankets. Zoila helped by carrying in his saddlebags, her movements careful and deliberate as if trying to prove her worth. The cabin door creaked open to reveal a single room, neat but lived in. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across the log walls. Zoila's eyes widened as she took in the rows of books lining rough-hewn shelves. More books than she'd ever seen outside the town's small church. An old family Bible lay open on the mantel, its pages worn soft with years of daily reading. Beside It stood a small daguerreotype in a silver frame, showing a woman with kind eyes and a young girl with flowing dark hair. Zoila's gaze lingered on the image, but she didn't ask about it. "Hungry?" Donald asked, moving to the iron pot hanging near the hearth. The rich smell of venison stew filled the warm air. He ladled generous portions into 2 bowls while Zoila stood studying the careful needlework that hung on the wall. Bright flowers and birds stitched by hands long stilled. "My wife Sarah made those," Donald said quietly, setting the bowls on the sturdy table. "She loved bringing color and beauty into our home." Zoila touched the embroidery gently before joining him at the table. The wooden chairs creaked as they sat down to their meal. Neither spoke as they ate, the silence heavy with unspoken words and new beginnings. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but within the solid log walls, the room felt like a sanctuary. Donald watched the girl across from him, noting how she tried to eat slowly despite her obvious hunger. Her eyes kept returning to the books on the shelves, drawn to them like a moth to flame. In that moment, seeing hope kindle in her expression, he knew he'd made the right choice in that saloon. No matter what trouble might come of it, the morning crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pearl and gold. Donald McCord stood at his cabin window, watching the pale light spread across pristine drifts that had fallen during the night. The familiar sight brought him peace, though worry gnawed at the edges of his mind. He turned to find Zoila already awake, carefully folding the blankets he'd given her for her makeshift bed near the hearth. Her movements were quick and precise, like a small bird's. "Reckon it's time you learned some cabin ways," he said, reaching for his heavy coat. Outside, their breath clouded in the crisp air as Donald led her to the woodpile. Frost crunched beneath their boots, and the morning sun cast long blue shadows across the snow. He demonstrated how to place a log on the splitting stump, showing her the proper stance and grip on the hatchet. "Like this," he said, bringing the blade down in one smooth motion. The wood split with a satisfying crack. "Not too hard. Just let the weight of the axe do the work." Zoila's first few attempts glanced off the wood, but she didn't give up. Her face set with determination as she adjusted her grip and tried again. When she finally split a piece cleanly, a faint smile touched her lips. The first real smile Donald had seen from her. "Well done," he nodded, watching her stack the kindling with careful pride. Her small hands worked steadily, each piece placed just so, as if trying to prove her worth through every simple task. The sun had climbed to its midday height when hoofbeats approached through the snow. Donald recognized the preacher's elderly mule before the man himself came into view. Reverend Stevens dismounted stiffly, his lined face creased with concern. "Brother McCord," he said, stamping his feet to warm them. "Might we speak privately?" Donald nodded to Zoila, who disappeared inside the cabin. The 2 men walked a few paces away, their boots leaving deep prints in the fresh snow. "There's trouble brewing in town," the preacher said without preamble. "That father of hers is running his mouth, claiming you stole his daughter away." He shook his head sadly. "But that ain't the worst of it." Donald's weathered face darkened. "Go on. That railroad agent Harrison, he's taking an interest in the matter. Been asking questions, stirring up folks' opinions." The preacher adjusted his worn collar against the cold. "We both know he's been after this valley land for months. Reckon he sees this as an opportunity." Donald frowned, his jaw tightening as he looked out across the snow-covered valley that had been his home for 15 years. He'd dealt with Harrison before, a slick-talking man with cold eyes who measured everything in dollars and cents. The laws got to see what that man was doing in that saloon wasn't right, Donald said firmly. "Law's one thing, Brother McCord. Money and influence is another." The preacher sighed heavily. "Just thought you should know what's coming. I'll do what I can to calm waters in town." But he left the sentence hanging like icicles from a roof edge. After the preacher rode away, Donald spent the afternoon lost in thought while he mended harness leather. Inside the cabin, Zoila moved quietly about, straightening what was already tidy. As evening approached, she began humming softly while sweeping the plank floor, a gentle melody that caught Donald's attention. He recognized it as an old Cherokee hymn, one he'd heard years ago when trading with the mountain bands. The tune carried both sorrow and hope, like sunshine through rain. It spoke of his young charge's heritage, her Cherokee mother's influence living on in her daughter's voice. Zoila paused when she noticed him listening. "My mother taught me," she said softly, before she left us." Donald nodded, understanding all that remained unspoken. "You're safe here," he said firmly, wanting to reassure her. But doubt nagged at him, knowing the forces gathering against them in town. He wondered if he could truly protect her from what was coming. As darkness fell, they sat at the table sharing hot cornbread and the last of the stew. The awkwardness of the previous night had eased somewhat, replaced by a tentative comfort. Zoila even asked about one of the books she'd been eyeing on his shelf, her face brightening when he said she could read any of them she liked. Outside, snow began falling again, thick flakes swirling in the lantern light that spilled from the windows. The fresh powder would seal them in for now, but Donald knew their sanctuary was temporary. The weight of uncertainty settled over the cabin like the deepening snow, even as they sat in its warm lamplight, sharing the simple meal in companionable quiet. For 2 days, the storm wrapped Donald's cabin in a blanket of white. Wind whistled through the eaves while snow piled against the doors, sealing them inside like bears in winter den. Donald kept the hearth stoked high, its flames painting the cabin walls in warm orange light. On the morning of the 3rd day, the sky cleared to a crisp blue. Zoila helped Donald dig paths to the chicken coop and woodpile, her cheeks rosy from the cold. Back inside, he noticed her eyeing the books on his shelf again. "Wait here," Donald said, crossing to an old chest beneath the window. He rummaged inside and pulled out several sheets of yellowed paper and a stubby pencil. "Found these last summer. Reckon they might interest you." Zoila's eyes lit up at the sight. She settled near the hearth, carefully smoothing a sheet on the plank floor. Donald watched, amazed, as she gripped the pencil with sure fingers and began forming letters with neat, flowing strokes. "Zoila," she spelled aloud, showing him her handiwork. Her name stood proud on the paper, each letter precise and clear. "Well, I'll be," Donald murmured, genuinely impressed. He reached for the Bible on the mantel, holding it out to her. "Can you read this too?" Zoila nodded, opening to a marked page. Her voice, though soft, carried strength as she read. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Donald settled into his chair, letting her words wash over him. When she finished, he cleared his throat. "Truth is, I never properly learned my letters. Can scratch my name when needed, but that's about all." Zoila looked up at him, considering. Then she patted the floor beside her. "I could teach you," she offered quietly. "If you want to learn." Donald hesitated only a moment before lowering himself to sit cross-legged beside her. She showed him how to hold the pencil, her small hand guiding his larger one. "Start with A," she instructed. "Draw a peak, like a mountain, then put a line across." They worked through the alphabet slowly. Donald's letters came out crooked and uncertain, but Zoila praised each attempt. Her patience reminded him of his late wife Sarah, who had always met his frustrations with gentle understanding. The days fell into a rhythm. Mornings meant feeding chickens and gathering eggs, the hens clucking around their feet. Afternoons brought necessary repairs, Donald showing Zoila how to oil leather harnesses and patch warm blankets. But evenings belonged to their lessons. They sat at the table after supper, lamplight pooling around them as they practiced writing. Donald thought often of his brother Thomas back east, 15 years since they'd last spoken, parting in anger over their father's will. One evening, he carefully wrote out Thomas McCord while Zoila watched. "Is that someone you know?" she asked. Donald nodded slowly. "My brother. Haven't written him in a long while. Maybe it's time I did. My mother used to say it's never too late to mend broken things," Zoila said softly. She traced her finger over a knot in the wooden table. She was Cherokee. The townfolk, they weren't kind to her. Made Papa angry and mean, especially after she died. Donald's heart ached at the pain in her voice. He thought carefully before speaking. "Your mother's people have wisdom worth learning from. Don't let anyone tell you different." Zoila's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "She taught me to read from her Bible. Said knowledge was something nobody could take away. She sounds like a wise woman," Donald said gently. "You do her proud, teaching me like this." A smile touched Zoila's lips as she bent over the paper again, showing him how to form the next word. Outside, stars wheeled above the snowy mountains, but inside the cabin, something new was growing. No longer just two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming something more. Family forged in shared words and quiet understanding. As they worked on their letters, Donald felt the weight of his own past losses lifting slightly. In teaching him to write, Zoila was also teaching him to hope again. Each careful stroke of the pencil built trust between them, stronger than the bonds of blood that had failed them both. The morning sun melted patches of snow, revealing brown grass beneath. Donald hitched the wagon while Zoila gathered empty sacks for supplies. Their list was short: flour, salt, coffee, but necessary enough to brave town gossip. "Stay close," Donald said as they rolled down the mountain trail. Zoila nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. The wagon wheels creaked through muddy ruts left by the melting snow. Main Street looked different in daylight. Without the saloon's yellow glow, the weathered buildings stood stark against the sky. Townsfolk paused their business to stare as Donald helped Zoila down from the wagon. He felt their eyes following them into the mercantile inside. The store smelled of leather and coffee beans. The shopkeeper's wife pursed her lips but said nothing as Donald set their items on the counter. Zoila stayed behind him, one hand gripping his coat. Through the front window, Donald noticed a well-dressed man watching them. His suit was too fine for a mining town, and his eyes held the sharp calculation of someone used to getting his way. "That will be $1.25. The shopkeeper said stiffly. Donald counted out coins while Zoila gathered their packages. As they stepped outside, the suited man approached, adjusting his silk tie. "Mr. McCord," he said smoothly. "A word, if you please." Donald positioned himself between the man and Zoila. "State your business." "Jerome Wilson, Northern Pacific Railroad." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I understand you've taken responsibility for the girl." A noble gesture, but perhaps impractical. "There are proper channels for such matters. She's safe where she is," Donald growled. Wilson's voice lowered. "The territory has facilities for orphans. Places where she might be better, cared for, under proper guardianship. Already told you she's safe. The law has certain requirements," Wilson said, examining his fingernails. "Requirements that can be interpreted various ways, depending on who does the interpreting." Donald stepped closer, using his height to loom over the railroad man. "That a threat?" Wilson's smirk widened. "Simply an observation. Money speaks clearly in these matters." "Good day, Mr. McCord." He tipped his hat and strolled away, leaving the taste of bile in Donald's mouth. The ride home was quiet, both of them troubled by the encounter. At the cabin, Donald stabled the horses while Zoila put away supplies. When he came inside, he found her kneeling by her small bundle of belongings. "Found something," she said softly, holding up a battered tin box. "It was Mama's," never opened it before. Donald sat beside her as she worked the rusty latch. Inside lay a folded paper, yellow with age but carefully preserved. Zoila handed it to him with trembling fingers. Donald smoothed it open, squinting at the formal writing. His heart skipped as he realized what he held. A land deed, properly signed and witnessed. The description placed the parcel in the valley below. Prime bottom land along the creek. Your mama owned this land free and clear, he said slowly. And if I reckon right, it's sitting right where that railroad means to lay track. Zoila's eyes widened. Is that why that man? Donald nodded grimly. Explains his interest. That deed makes you heir to land worth fighting for. He stood and began preparing their evening meal, mind churning. The stew bubbled as he explained what he knew of railroad expansion, how they bought or forced out smaller landowners to make way for the iron horse. Your mama left you something precious, he said, setting bowls on the table. But it makes you a threat to men who want that land. Zoila stirred her stew, shoulders bent under this new burden. What should we do? Keep that deed safe, first thing. Donald reached for the Bible on the mantel. We'll put it here for now. Then tomorrow, I'll ride to see Judge Matthews. He's honest, for all his gruffness. Need to know where we stand by law. They ate quietly, each lost in thought. The tin box sat on the mantel, humble container of such weighty contents. Donald watched Zoila push her food around and wished he could shield her from the battles ahead. But she had inherited more than land. She had her mother's quiet strength. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine despite her feared dot as darkness gathered outside. They sat by the fire, the deed safely tucked away in sacred pages. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that echoed the uncertainty in their hearts. The morning sun sparkled off fresh snow as Donald guided the wagon toward town. Zoila sat beside him in her best dress, faded but clean, with a careful patch at one elbow. She had braided her dark hair with extra care, though her fingers kept worrying the end of one plait. Reckon we're early enough for a good seat, Donald said, noting other wagons converging on the white-painted church. The bell tolled across the valley, calling folk to worship. Zoila's shoulders tensed as they approached the hitching posts. What if people stare? Let them, Donald replied gently. We got as much right to be here as anyone. The church steps creaked under their boots. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow across wooden pews. A few heads turned as Donald and Zoila found seats near the back, but the organist's hymn drowned any whispers. Preacher Adams stood at the pulpit, his Bible open before him. His kind eyes found Zoila, and he offered a small nod before beginning the service. Today's scripture speaks of God's particular love for those the world counts least. He began. Donald watched Zoila from the corner of his eye as the preacher's words filled the sanctuary. Her hands lay still in her lap, but tears traced silent paths down her cheeks when the sermon touched on divine adoption, how the Lord claims the unwanted as his beloved children. No soul is worthless. In God's eyes, Preacher Adams declared, his voice rising, not one sparrow falls without his notice. How much more does he value each human heart, created in his image? The congregation responded with scattered amens. Donald noticed several people, glancing their way with softening expressions. After the final hymn, folk lingered to share news and greetings. Donald expected to make a quick exit, but neighbors approached one by one. Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, pressed a wrapped loaf into Zoila's hands. Fresh this morning, she said warmly. You're looking well, child. Old Tom Jenkins, who'd lost his own daughter to fever years back, clapped Donald's shoulder. You done right by her, he said gruffly. Don't let nobody tell you different. Even those who held back seemed less hostile than before. Donald saw understanding dawn in some faces. Perhaps hearing God's word had opened hearts that fear had closed. That evening, lantern lights spilled from the church windows as townspeople gathered again. Donald hadn't planned to attend, but Zoila asked to go when she heard singing. Inside, the mood was different from morning service, more urgent, more earthly. The railroad's been pushing folks around up and down the line, Mr. Peterson was saying as they slipped into a back pew. Using the law like a club when money won't do it. Heads nodded. Stories circulated of other communities fighting similar battles. Well, they won't find us easy picking, declared Tom Jenkins. We stand together here. Amen to that, came voices from around the room. The girl stays where she's safe. Someone started a hymn, and others joined in. Donald felt Zoila straighten beside him as the music swelled. Her clear voice rose with the congregation, trembling at first but growing stronger. The sound filled his chest with an ache he hadn't felt since his own child's passing. The ride home was quiet except for their horses' hooves crushing snow. Stars pierced the dark sky, and their breath fogged in the cold air. Mr. McCord? Zoila's voice was small but steady. Yes? Would you? She paused, gathering courage. Would you ever think about adopting me? Making it proper-like? Donald's hands tightened on the reins. He'd been turning the idea over in his mind, especially after seeing how the town was coming around. But the path ahead still held dangers. Been thinking on it, he admitted. But we got some struggles to face first. That railroad won't give up easy, and your father might make trouble. Zoila nodded, accepting this answer with the quiet dignity that sometimes made her seem older than her years. At the cabin, she helped him stable the horse and then went straight to preparing their evening meal. Donald watched her move about the kitchen, setting plates and stirring the pot of beans she'd left simmering. Her eyes held a new light, as if the day's events had kindled something within her. Soup's ready, she announced, ladling portions into bowls with careful pride. They sat down to eat, the cabin warm against the winter night. Donald saw hope in Zoila's face that hadn't been there before. The town support had shown her she wasn't alone, that good folk would stand against injustice. Maybe that was worth more than any legal paper, he thought. That and the trust growing between them, as steady as the hearth fire's glow. 5 days passed in peaceful rhythm at Donald McCord's mountain cabin. Each morning, Zoila helped him haul water from the creek, her small boots crunching beside his larger tracks in the snow. They mended winter-damaged fences together, Donald showing her how to splice rope and test posts for sturdiness. During breaks, he shared tales of his trapping days while she told him about a Cherokee mother's stories of the stars. The routine felt natural now, like they'd known each other longer than these few short weeks. Even the silences were comfortable as they worked side by side in the crisp mountain air. That evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks and cast long shadows across the snow, Donald stoked the hearth fire while Zoila stirred a pot of beans. The temperature was dropping fast, bringing a bitter wind that rattled the cabin's shutters. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both freeze. Donald moved to the window, his weathered face tightening at what he saw. Stay inside, he told Zoila quietly. She nodded, but crept to peek through a crack between the logs as Donald stepped onto the porch. Her father sat astride his horse in the yard, straight-backed and clear-eyed, a stark change from his usual drunken slouch. The man's gaze was sharp, calculating, and entirely sober. Come to collect my daughter, he announced, his voice carrying on the cold air. Donald planted his feet firmly. She ain't going nowhere she don't want to. Never signed away my rights, her father sneered. Law's on my side, McCord. Best step aside now. Law don't favor men who try selling children for whiskey money. Her father's lip curled. Railroad agent sees things different. Says he'll make it worth my while to exercise my rightful claim. He leaned forward in his saddle. Mighty generous offer he made too. Donald's hand drifted to the rifle propped by the door. though he didn't grasp it. The tension crackled like static before a storm. Inside, Zoila pressed herself against the wall, trembling. Hoofbeats approached from the trail. Preacher Adams appeared on his mule, as if Providence itself had sent him. He assessed the scene with keen eyes as he dismounted. "Evening, brothers," the preacher said calmly. "Seems we need to talk this through peaceful-like." "Ain't nothing to talk about," Zoila's father spat. "That man's keeping my property from me." "Property?" The preacher's voice sharpened. "We're speaking of a child of God, sir. One you tried to trade for drink not 2 weeks past. And I'll be back with the law to set it straight," her father declared. His horse danced beneath him, sensing his tension. "Railroad's lawyer says I got full rights. We'll see how righteous you all feel when the sheriff comes calling." He wheeled his horse around, but paused to call over his shoulder. "Best pack her things, McCord. Won't be long now." With that, he spurred his mount and vanished into the gathering dusk. Donald's shoulders remained rigid until the hoofbeats faded. The preacher laid a steadying hand on his arm. "We'll stand with you, brother. The town won't let this pass quietly." After the preacher departed, Donald found Zoila huddled by the hearth. She latched onto his sleeve the moment he knelt beside her, her fingers twisting in the warm fabric. "He can't take me," she whispered. "Please don't let him." "Ain't planning to," Donald assured her. The worry gnawed at his gut. He'd seen railroad money work its influence before. They ate their supper in uneasy silence. The beans had scorched slightly during the confrontation, but neither mentioned it. Zula pushed her food around her plate, taking only the smallest bites. After the dishes were cleared, Donald did something he hadn't done since losing his wife and child years before. He reached for the family Bible on the mantel, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of hands. Zoila watched wide-eyed as he opened it, running his finger along the lines until he found what he sought. "Lord," he began roughly, his voice growing steadier as he continued. "Been a long time since I asked anything of you. Reckon I was too angry after Sarah and little Emma went to glory." He swallowed hard. "But I'm asking now, give me strength to protect this child. Show us the path through this valley, and let right prevail over railroad gold." Zoila's small hand slipped into his as he spoke. Her touch anchored him, reminding him what they fought for. Not just her safety, but her right to grow up where love outweighed greed. When he finished praying, the cabin felt warmer somehow, despite the bitter wind still rattling the shutters. Something had shifted between them, a deeper trust taking root. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. But Donald McCord felt no peace in the morning's beauty. The crunch of wagon wheels on frozen ground made his heart sink as he spotted 2 deputies driving up the trail, Zoila's father riding smugly beside them. Donald stepped onto the cabin's porch, his boots creaking against frost-covered boards. Behind him, Zoila pressed close to his back, her small fingers gripping his coat. "Morning, McCord," the older deputy called out, adjusting his badge-weighted vest as he climbed down. "Got some business to attend to." The younger deputy unfolded official-looking papers, clearing his throat. "You're accused of unlawful detention of a minor child, sir. We have orders to return her to her father's custody pending investigation." "Detention?" Donald's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I saved her from being sold for 25 cents worth of whiskey. Ask anyone in town what happened that night. Papers don't mention that part," the older deputy said, though his eyes showed discomfort. "Law says she goes with her father until the hearing." Zoila's father smirked from atop his horse. "Told you the law would set things right." Donald felt Zoila trembling against him. "She ain't property to be passed around. She's a child of God who needs protecting. That's for the judge to decide," the younger deputy stated, moving toward the porch steps. "Now, please step aside, sir. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Zoila began to weep, the sound cutting straight to Donald's heart. "No, please," she begged. "Don't let them take me." The older deputy touched his hat apologetically. "Sorry, little lady. Law's the law. But don't fret. You'll be safe in county custody until things get sorted proper." As they led her to the wagon, Donald's hands clenched into fists. Every fiber of his being screamed to fight, but violence would only make things worse. Instead, he strode to the stable and saddled his horse. "I'm riding with you," he announced, swinging into the saddle. "Won't leave her alone through this." The deputies exchanged glances but nodded. They couldn't legally stop him from traveling the same road. The journey to the county seat stretched long and miserable. Winter-slick roads forced them to move slowly, the wagon wheels fighting for purchase on packed snow and ice. Donald rode several yards behind, close enough to keep Zoila in sight, but far enough to honor the deputy's authority. Every few minutes, Zoila would look back at him, tears freezing on her cheeks. Each time, he nodded steadily, trying to convey strength and reassurance. Inside, his heart ached with memories of losing his own daughter, a pain he'd sworn never to feel again. The sun hung low and red on the horizon by the time they reached the county jail. The squat brick building loomed dark against the evening sky, its barred windows glaring like accusatory eyes. "Please," Donald tried one last time as they led Zoila inside. "She's just a child. Surely there's a better place." Judge's orders specifically said secure custody. The older deputy cut in, though his voice held regret. "But we'll make sure she's comfortable as can be." Donald watched helplessly as they took her through heavy wooden doors. The cell they led her to was clean but bare, its iron bars casting long shadows in the lamplight. A thin mattress lay in one corner, and a rough wool blanket was folded at its foot. "I'll be close by," Donald called to her. "Won't leave town until you're free." Zoila pressed against the bars, reaching one small hand through. "Promise?" "On my life," he answered, his voice rough with emotion. The deputies ushered him out, explaining visiting hours and procedures. Outside, Donald stood in the gathering dark, staring at the jail's cold walls until Preacher Adams appeared at his elbow. "Come along, brother," the preacher said gently. "We've work to do if we're to help her. We've work to do if we're to help her." They walked through snow-hushed streets to the church, where lamplight glowed welcome from the study windows. Inside, the preacher's desk was already spread with law books borrowed from the town judge's library. "Railroad money's bought influence," the preacher admitted, settling behind his desk. "But truth and right still carry weight in these parts. We'll need every scrap of evidence about that night in the saloon." Donald sank into a worn leather chair, his shoulders heavy with worry. Not near 20 witnesses saw her father try to sell her. That must count for something. It will. The preacher began making notes. "And we'll need to speak about adoption papers, making your guardianship legal and binding." They worked late into the night, planning strategy for the hearing. Every few minutes, Donald's eyes strayed to the window, thinking of Zoila alone in her cell. The thought kept his resolve burning strong, even as exhaustion pulled at him. "Lord willing," the preacher said softly, "we'll have her home soon." Donald nodded, turning another page. He wouldn't rest until Zoila was safe again, no matter what it took. Night crept over the county jail like a heavy blanket, but brought no comfort to Zoila. She huddled on the thin mattress, pulling the rough wool blanket tight around her shoulders. The cell felt colder than any winter night she'd spent in Donald's cabin. Moonlight filtered through the barred window, casting stark shadows across the stone floor. Closing her eyes, Zoila began to hum the Cherokee hymn her mother had taught her. The familiar melody echoed softly against the cell walls, each note carrying memories of gentle hands and quiet strength. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she kept humming, finding solace in the ancient words about faith and perseverance. "That's mighty pretty," the night guard commented kindly, passing by with his lantern. "Sounds like church music," Zoila nodded but didn't speak, drawing further into herself as his footsteps faded down the corridor. Morning brought Donald's familiar heavy tread. He appeared at the bars, his weathered face lined with concern. "Brought you some fresh biscuits," he said, passing them through to her. "Mrs. Peterson from church baked them special." "Thank you," Zoila whispered, accepting the still warm package. The smell reminded her of home, not her father's shanty, but Donald's cabin with its welcoming hearth. "Listen close now," Donald said, his voice low and steady. "I ain't leaving you here alone. The preacher's working with the county clerk right now, getting us a proper hearing. Lots of folks in town are standing with us." Zoila pressed closer to the bars. "What if Father wins? What if the railroad men—" "Hush now," Donald interrupted gently. "Truth's stronger than money, and God's stronger than both. You just keep your courage up." Across town in the courthouse, Preacher Adams stood before the county clerk's desk, his Bible tucked under one arm. "These are good people caught in an unjust situation," he explained. "That child needs protection, not possession." The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, shuffled through the papers. "Earliest I can schedule the hearing is tomorrow morning. Judge Matthews takes a dim view of selling children, railroad interests or no." Word spread through town like wildfire. Women gathered after church services, whispering prayers and planning to attend the hearing. Men stood in clusters outside the general store, discussing what they'd witnessed that night in the saloon. Even the bartender, usually neutral in such matters, spoke openly about Zoila's father's cruel offer. Back in his room at the boarding house, Donald sat at a small desk, gripping Zoila's pencil awkwardly. The letters were still strange to his calloused fingers, but he pressed on, writing his statement for the judge. Each word came slow but heartfelt. "Your Honor," he wrote carefully, "I ain't a man of learning, but I know right from wrong. That night in the saloon, I saw Father try to sell his own flesh and blood for 25 cents of whiskey money. The good book says we're to protect the innocent. That's all I aim to do." As night fell again, Donald knelt beside his bed for the first time since losing his wife and daughter years ago. "Lord," he prayed, his voice rough with emotion, "I've carried my grief like a shield, keeping everyone at arm's length. But that little girl needs me now. Help me be worthy of her trust. And if it's your will, help me make her my daughter proper." The weight of years of unspoken prayers lifted from his shoulders as he surrendered his fear to God. Peace settled over him, even as he worried about the trial ahead. Dawn broke bitter cold over the courthouse. Frost painted delicate patterns on the windows, and breath clouded in the air as townspeople gathered. Donald stood before the mirror, straightening his best coat, the one he hadn't worn since his wife's funeral. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed his beard and adjusted his collar. "Lord, give me words," he whispered, touching the folded paper in his pocket where he'd written his statement. In his other pocket, he carried Zoila's mother's deed, proof of the railroad's true interest in the case. The preacher knocked softly at his door. "It's time, Brother McCord. The judge is ready to hear us." Donald drew a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt the solid ground of faith beneath his feet. Whatever came next, he would face it with truth and prayer as his weapons. He stopped at the jail first, looking in on Zoila one last time before the hearing. She stood at her cell window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope. "Ready?" he asked softly. She turned to him, her young face solemn but unafraid. "Ready," she answered, and began to hum her mother's hymn again. This time, Donald hummed with her, their voices joining in quiet harmony as morning light filled the cell. The county courthouse filled quickly that morning, its wooden benches creaking under the weight of concerned citizens. Miners still dusty from their shifts sat shoulder to shoulder with proper ladies in their Sunday best. Near the front, railroad men in fine suits whispered among themselves. their watch chains glinting in the pale light filtering through tall windows. Sheriff Turner led Zoila in, her small frame dwarfed by his bulk. Donald's heart clenched at the sight of her bound wrists, but he kept his face steady. The girl took her seat near the preacher, her eyes finding Donald's for a moment of silent strength. Judge Matthews, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair, called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The sound echoed through the suddenly quiet room like gunshots. "We're here today," the judge announced, his voice carrying to the rafters, "to determine the rightful custody of one Zoila May." Zoila's father, Timothy May, took the stand first. He had sobered up for the occasion, wearing a borrowed coat that hung loose on his thin frame. "That mountain man there," he pointed at Donald, "he stole my daughter right out of town. No right to do such a thing. She's my flesh and blood. And your dealings with her that night at the saloon?" The county prosecutor prompted. May shifted in his seat. "Was just playing with the boys. Didn't mean nothing by it." The railroad agent, Marcus Wheeler, testified next. His polished boots clicked across the floorboards as he approached the stand. "McCord's been a problem since we started surveying the valley," he declared smoothly. "Lives like a hermit up there, suspicious of everyone. No fit guardian for a young girl." Donald sat silent through it all, his large hands clenched into fists on his knees. The preacher touched his arm gently, reminding him to stay calm. When Donald's turn came, he moved to the stand with deliberate steps. The old floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he settled into the witness chair. He looked first at Zoila, then directly at the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice rough but clear. "I ain't much for fancy words, but I know right from wrong. That night in the saloon, I watched this man." He nodded toward May, lay down 25 cents and offered to sell his own daughter for whiskey. Money. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Several women covered their mouths in shock. Judge Matthews leaned forward, his bushy eyebrows drawn together. "The men, they were laughing," Donald continued steadily, "treating it like sport. But I saw that little girl trembling, and I thought of my own daughter, gone these past years. Couldn't stand by and watch another child cast aside like she wasn't worth more than $0.25. The judge's pen scratched across paper. "And you took her to your home?" "Yes, sir. Gave her a warm bed, 3 meals a day, and safety. She's been teaching me my letters." A ghost of a smile touched Donald's weathered face. "Reckon she's done more good for me than I have for her." Preacher Adams stood then, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Your Honor, there's something else the court should consider." He approached the bench, presenting the deed from Zoila's mother's tin box. "This land deed belongs to Zoila, inherited from her Cherokee mother. It happens to lie directly in the path of the proposed railroad line." This revelation sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the courthouse. The railroad men sat up straighter, their faces darkening. Judge Matthews studied the document carefully, adjusting his spectacles. "This adds another dimension to the case," the judge mused. He looked at the railroad agent, whose smooth composure had cracked slightly. "Perhaps explain some interests here beyond simple family matters." Wheeler started to rise, but his lawyer pulled him back down, whispering urgently. The afternoon light was growing long through the windows when Judge Matthews cleared his throat. "I've heard from the father, from Mr. McCord, and from various witnesses. But there's one voice we haven't heard." He looked directly at Zoila. "Tomorrow morning, I want to hear from the child herself. She's old enough to speak her truth." Zoila's eyes went wide, her small hands clutching the rail before her. Donald wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but the bailiff's stance warned him to keep his distance. "Court will reconvene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," the judge declared, bringing down his gavel. "The child will remain in protective custody until then." As the crowd began to disperse, Donald caught Zoila's eye once more. He touched his heart and then pointed upward, their private signal for prayer. She responded with a tiny nod, her chin lifting with determination despite her fear. The preacher gathered his Bible and papers. "The truth is coming to light," he told Donald softly. "Now we must trust that small voice to carry it home." Donald watched as the sheriff led Zoila back toward the jail. Tomorrow, everything would rest on the courage of one young girl to speak her truth before the power of money and the force of law. Morning. Sunlight streamed through the courthouse's frosted windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Frost patterns on the glass sparkled like delicate lace, a reminder of the bitter cold outside. Inside, the packed room held its collective breath as Sheriff Turner led Zoila to the witness stand. Donald watched from his seat, his heart aching at how small she looked up there. Her worn dress had been carefully pressed, and someone, likely the jailer's wife, had braided her dark hair neatly. Despite her obvious fear, Zoila's spine was straight as a pine sapling. Judge Matthews adjusted his spectacles, his voice gentler than it had been the day before. "State your name for the record, child." "Zoila May." "Your Honor." Her voice quavered but carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. "Do you understand why you're here today?" Zoila's hands twisted in her lap. "Yes, sir." "To decide if I'm property to be sold or a person with rights of my own." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The railroad agent, Wheeler, shifted uncomfortably in his seat while Zoila's father glared from the back row. "Tell us about that night in the saloon," the judge prompted. Zoila took a deep breath, her eyes finding Donald's for strength. "My father was drinking. He'd been drinking for days, like he'd done since Mama died. He'd put a quarter on the counter and said anyone could have me for the price of whiskey." Her voice caught, but she pressed on. The men were laughing. "But Mr. McCord," he stood up. "Said I was worth millions more than that. Said I had a soul that couldn't be bought." Several women in the crowd dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The preacher nodded encouragingly from his seat near Donald. "And after that?" the judge asked. "Mr. McCord took me to his cabin, gave me a warm bed and food. He lets me read from the Bible and teaches me about the land." Zoila's voice grew stronger. "He never treated me like I was worthless. He listens when I speak and shows me how to do things proper." Wheeler's lawyer stood. "But surely a young girl needs her father, not some mountain hermit?" Zoila's chin lifted. "My father stopped being a father when Mama died. He forgot the teaching she gave me about our Cherokee ways. Forgot how she said every person has worth in the Creator's eyes." Her dark eyes flashed. "I am not property to be bought or sold. I am a child of God, and my mother left me her land legal and proper." The courthouse fell silent. You could hear the tick of the judge's pocket watch. Wheeler started to rise, his face flushed with anger, but his lawyer pulled him back down. Around the room, townsfolk nodded in approval, some whispering amen under their breath. Judge Matthews leaned forward, studying Zoila intently. "You speak well for one so young. Your mother taught you to read?" "Yes, sir. She said knowledge was power that couldn't be taken away." "I've been teaching Mr. McCord his letters too." A small smile touched her lips. "He's learning real good." Donald felt his ears grow warm, but pride swelled in his chest at her words. The railroad agent couldn't contain himself any longer. He burst to his feet. "This is absurd. She's just a child. That land deed is legal and binding." The judge cut in sharply. "As verified by this court yesterday." He turned back to Zoila. "One last question, child. Where do you wish to live?" Zoila didn't hesitate. "With Mr. McCord, sir. He makes me feel safe. Like I matter." Sunlight broke through a cloud outside, flooding the courtroom with golden light. The judge nodded slowly, gathering his papers. "I believe I've heard enough to render a decision. However, such matters require careful consideration. Court will adjourn until noon. As Sheriff Turner helped Zoila down from the stand, Donald rose to meet her. The bailiff started forward, but Judge Matthews waved him back. Let them have a moment. Donald clasped Zoila's small hand in his weathered one. You did real fine up there, child. Spoke true and clear. Zoila squeezed his fingers. I was scared, she whispered. But I remember what you said about fear not being as strong as truth. The preacher approached, resting a hand on Zoila's shoulder. The Lord gives strength to those who stand for what's right. You showed great courage today. Around them, the courthouse slowly emptied as people filed out to await the judge's decision. Wheeler and his men huddled with their lawyer in one corner, their faces dark with frustration. Zoila's father had already slipped away, leaving only the lingering smell of whiskey in his wake. Donald held Zoila's hand until the last possible moment before the sheriff led her back to her temporary cell. Her steps were lighter now, hope visible in the set of her shoulders. As she disappeared through the heavy door, Donald touched his heart and pointed upward. Through the door's small window, he saw her return the gesture. While the courthouse emptied for recess, Reverend Thomas Miller traced his steps through fresh snow toward the saloon. He knew he would find John May there, drowning his sorrows as he had done every day since the trial began. The preacher's boots crunched against the frozen ground as he offered a silent prayer for wisdom. Inside the dim saloon, tobacco smoke hung thick in the air. John May hunched alone at the end of the bar, his shoulders curved over a half-empty glass. The barkeep caught the preacher's eye and nodded slightly, sliding away to give them privacy. John, Reverend Miller said softly, settling onto the stool beside him. We need to talk. May's bloodshot eyes flickered up, then back to his whiskey. Come to lecture me, preacher? No, Miller's voice remained gentle. I came to remind you of something. Do you remember the day Zoila was born? The glass in May's hand trembled slightly. What of it? You came running to the church at dawn, shouting with joy. Said she had her mother's eyes, most beautiful thing you'd ever seen. Miller watched May's face carefully. You were so proud, John, carried her everywhere, showing her off to anyone who'd look. That was before. May's voice cracked. Before Sarah died. Before the drink became more important than your little girl. Miller didn't flinch when May's head snapped up angrily. Sarah's death broke something in you, John, but it broke something in Zoila, too. She lost her mama and her papa both that day. May's hand clenched around his glass. You don't understand. I understand grief. John, what you did in that saloon, trying to sell your own flesh and blood for whiskey money. Miller shook his head slowly. That wasn't grief. That was the devil in the bottle speaking. I never meant, May's voice hitched. I don't remember half of what I do anymore. Remember now. Look at what you're doing to her. Fighting to drag her back, not because you want to care for her, but because railroad money would buy more whiskey. Miller leaned closer. Your Sarah would weep to see it. The glass slipped from May's fingers, clattering empty on the bar. His shoulders began to shake. I can't even look at her sometimes. She looks so much like Sarah. That's a blessing, John, not a curse. Sarah lives on in that child. Her strength, her dignity, her faith. Miller rested a hand on May's trembling shoulder. But you're destroying her last gift to you. A raw sob tore from May's throat. He buried his face in his hands, years of buried shame breaking loose like spring ice. What have I done? Dear God, what have I done to my little girl? God's mercy is bigger than our sins, John. Miller squeezed his shoulder. But you have to choose the bottle or your daughter's future. Choose the bottle or your daughter's future. I can't keep her. May's words came between sobs. I'm not fit. Haven't been fit since Sarah died. But I can stop fighting McCord. Let her have a real home. That would be a true father's choice, Miller said softly. Putting her welfare before your pride. May wiped his face with shaking hands. The court, It's almost time. Yes. Miller stood, offering his arm. Come. Do right by your daughter. John, it's not too late for that. The courthouse had refilled by the time they arrived. Tension thick in the air as Judge Matthews took his seat. Wheeler, the railroad agent, smirked confidently at his lawyers. Donald sat straight-backed beside Zoila, his weathered hand protective near her shoulder. Before the judge could speak, John May stepped forward, his voice rough but clear. Your Honor, I got something to say. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge nodded slowly. Proceed, Mr. May. I'm withdrawing my claim. May's words fell into stunned silence. I'm not fit to be nobody's father. Not anymore. Been too long lost in the bottle. His voice broke as he turned toward Zoila. I'm sorry, girl. Sorry for everything. You deserve better than what I gave you. Better than what I am. Zoila's eyes filled with tears as her father continued, shoulders shaking. McGord's a good man. Treats you right. Like your mama would have wanted. He swallowed hard. I give up all claim. Let him adopt you proper, if he's willing. It's the only right thing I've done since your mama died. Wheeler leaped to his feet, face purple with rage. This is outrageous. We had an agreement. Selling my soul is one thing. May cut in. But I won't sell my daughter's life. Not again. He straightened his spine, meeting Wheeler's fury steadily. Keep your blood money. I choose my girl's happiness over your railroad schemes. The railroad agent sputtered, looking wildly around the courtroom. Finding no sympathy in the judge's stern face or the townspeople's hard stares, he snatched up his hat. This isn't over, he snarled, storming toward the door. His lawyers hurriedly gathered their papers and scurried after him. Silence held for a long moment after the door slammed. Then Judge Matthews cleared his throat. Wow, it seems the primary custody dispute has been resolved by the plaintiff's withdrawal. He peered at Donald. Mr. McCord, do you still wish to petition for legal guardianship of the child? Yes, Your Honor. Donald's voice was rough with emotion. With all my heart. Judge Matthews adjusted his spectacles, surveying the hushed courtroom. Having heard all testimony, and with the plaintiff's withdrawal of claim, this court finds in favor of the child, Zoila May. His gavel struck with purpose. She is hereby declared a free person, rightful heir to her mother's documented land claim, and no longer subject to paternal authority. The courtroom erupted in applause. Miners removed their hats, women dabbed at tears, and even the clerk smiled broadly. Donald's eyes glistened as he turned to face Zoila, whose cheeks were already wet with tears. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt before her chair. His voice was gentle, meant for her ears alone. Zoila, I know I can't replace what you've lost. But if you're willing, he swallowed hard. Would you accept me as your family? Let me be a father to you, proper and legal? Zoila's lower lip trembled. You already are, she whispered, throwing her arms around his neck. You already are. Reverend Miller stepped forward, his ledger open. Let's make it official, shall we? He dipped his pen and recorded their intent for adoption, his neat script marking the beginning of their new life together. May God bless this family, he pronounced, and the gathered townsfolk echoed, Amen. As evening settled over the valley, Donald and Zoila mounted up for the ride home. Snow began to fall, soft and clean, covering the day's tracks. Their lanterns swung gently from the saddle horn, casting warm light through the gathering dusk. The flame danced steady and bright, lighting their way back to the cabin that was now, truly, their home. The cabin welcomed them home with golden warmth spilling from its windows. Inside, the hearth crackled with fresh split logs, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Donald shrugged off his heavy coat while Zoila carefully removed her mother's deed from her shawl. This needs a proper place, she said, crossing to the old wooden chest beneath the window. She lifted the carved lid, breathing in the scent of cedar, and tucked the precious document inside. Her fingers lingered on its worn edges before letting it rest among Donald's treasured keepsakes. At the table. Its worn edges, before letting it rest among Donald's treasured keepsakes. At the table. Donald set out 2 tin plates, ladling hot stew from the iron pot. Steam rose in wisps as they bowed their heads together. Lord, Donald's voice was thick with emotion. We thank you for your mercy, for justice done, and for bringing this child safe to harbor. Zoila's soft amen joined his outside. The storm that had followed them home began to break. Moonlight pierced the clouds, turning the snow-covered valley into a sea of silver. Through the cleared glass, they could see all the way to the creek bottom, peaceful and still. Between spoonfuls of stew, Donald spoke of spring plans. Reckon it's time you learn proper hunting, he said. You'll need to know the land that's yours. Zoila's eyes brightened. And you'll need to know your letters proper, to write to your brother back east. Their laughter, warm and easy now, filled the cabin's corners. Donald watched his daughter by lamplight as she gathered their dishes. No longer the trembling girl from the saloon. Here stood a cherished child, worth, as he declared that first night, millions and more in God's eyes. The hearth flames danced low as they prepared for sleep, peace settling over them like a warm blanket. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.